Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our 7th plenary talk by Dr. Felipe González. He's a senior lecturer of economics at Queen Mary University of London. His research interest lies at the intersection of political economy, economic history, and public policy. Today, he will continue this week's discussion on Latin America in times of the Cold War. And here we will be talking about the political economy of Chile under Salvador Allende's presidency. Dr. Felipe, please.
Thank you. Nobody has called me before doctor, so that feels like the expectations are high now. Can I just share my screen? Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, cool. Okay, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here online to be discussing, well, something that I've been thinking about for almost 15 years now, since I took, I guess, my first history lessons or classes at the Catholic University in Chile, where I studied economics and a little bit of history as well. I've been doing research in this space for quite a bit of time now. I actually wrote my dissertation for my master's degree on Latin American Cold War. So it's exciting. It's been 15 years of building data sets, reading and trying to understand this period of time. So it's particularly, I'm particularly happy to be discussing this research with you. So I guess it's going to be a little bit different from previous lectures, at least from what I've seen on the website. I'm going to be talking about a time period there's lots of things going on in different countries in Latin America, and there is a lot going on also in Chile, especially before the Salvador Allende years in the 1960s, and well, a lot more after Salvador Allende in 1970s and 1980s. So I'll try to, I think a lot of what is happening during the Salvador Allende years, it's exemplifies very well many dynamics that are taking place in Latin America during the Cold War, especially at times where the U.S. is exerting a lot of pressure in the policy space in Latin America, and also there's lots of political conflict in a way between the left wing and the right wing, and dictatorships and democracies taking place in Latin America. So I'll try to, the way that I see this time period is there's definitely lots of changes in what people, I guess, demand. And you can trace these to many different processes that are taking place. Perhaps all of these, some economic historians could trace back to the Great Depression and how that, well, reverted lots of things that were happening kind of like internationally and through connections between different countries to more of like economic processes that were coming from the inside. So I think you've discussed a lot of like the import substitution policies that were taking place at the time, and that basically sparked lots of policy platforms that are somewhat, they have lots of similarities across Latin American countries. But I think a very important event that took place that I think you also discussed, that has been somewhat understudied in economic history. We actually have a big project trying to understand what was the impact of the Cuban Revolution in Latin America in general. I would say there's not much disagreement about the fact that the Cuban Revolution sparked a lot of internal revolutions in Latin American countries. Basically, one could summarize that as an increase in the demand for redistribution. So the working class started to demand more redistributive policies and just to have a little bit more in a way. I think the process through which the Cuban Revolution spread through Latin America is fascinating, and there are lots of different explanations for that, and hopefully we'll be able to contribute in the very near future to understand that process a little bit more. It's certainly something that has been studied significantly more in history than in economics, but similar processes have been studied in economics after that. So I think that one of the crucial things after one acknowledges that there is an increase in the demand for redistribution after 1959. Gradually, of course, this is history, so it's not kind of like a discrete jump in the demand after 1959. The real question is like, well, how do different countries absorb this demand and kind of like face the new reality in a way, or the new needs of the working class? And I think there's broadly two different things that could have happened. One of them is, well, in democracies, in well-functioning democracies, there should be a shifting political preferences towards the political parties that are more aligned with redistribution. In this case, would be kind of like left-wing parties, and you definitely see some of that taking place in Chile in the 1960s. The left wing becomes gradually more important in the political space, and also even the center political parties start to become more progressive in a way. They start to create more policies to satisfy these redistribution demands. So lots of policies were implemented. One of the obviously always the binding constraint in low and middle income countries such as Latin America at the time is the budget constraint. So I think an important institution that took place at the time, and I think you also discussed, is the Alliance for Progress, which basically financed a lot of redistributive policies. I think perhaps one of the most important ones was the land reform process. Directly or indirectly, it took place right after 1961, 1962, when the Alliance for Progress made basically a huge effort of the US to try to satisfy these demands for redistribution and kind of like prevent left-wing parties or left-wing revolution to basically arise from the ground up, to also kind of like get more power in this ideological war with the USSR, right? So with the Soviet Union. I think this is kind of like a broad theme in Latin America in the 1960s. There is this increasing demand for redistribution. Countries are dealing with this demand differently depending on how democracies and dictatorship were taking place at the time, and certainly a lot of political processes start to unravel during this time period. So having said that, towards the end of the 1960s, the left wing in Chile was accumulating a lot of power, and for the first time, when the 1970 presidential election took place, well, the left wing saw a real opportunity to basically win the election, and this was something relatively new. So Salvador Allende, this is a fairly well-functioning democracy at the time in 1950s and 1960s in Chile. Women could vote. The secret ballot was introduced in 1958. Elections were relatively fair and open and free and democratic. And Salvador Allende was trying to become president as the leader of the left-wing coalition for the fourth time. So he was actually candidate in 1952, in 1958, 1964, and 1970. And in 1964, he was actually pretty close to win the election. But the center political party that is represented by the Christian Democrats in Chile and the right-wing parties actually got together to defeat Salvador Allende in a very well-studied election in which the US actually provided a lot of monetary resources for the center party and the right-wing parties to defeat Salvador Allende and to prevent basically the democratic arrival of socialism. We don't have very good estimates of what was the impact of the US in that election, and if in the absence of that outside intervention in a way, Salvador Allende would have won that election, but it's very well documented the amount of resources that were invested by the US. But finally in 1970, the Christian Democrats and the right-wing parties couldn't agree on a single candidate. So there was a very good chance that the left wing was going to win because there was three candidates, one from the left, one from the center, and one from the right. And it was basically what at the time was called the political 3/3. So Allende had a very good chance of basically going through more than 1/3 of the votes and finally becoming president of the country. So before that time, there's lots of things that are taking place. So the Christian Democrats were in power from 1964 to 1970, and they were trying to satisfy the demands for redistribution by implementing a pretty aggressive policy platform of land reform and other redistributive policies, because they obviously understood the kind of like the sentiment of the time, and they did a lot of very revolutionary things as well during those six years. And if you trace kind of like the implementation of policies at that time, you can see that they're implementing more and more aggressive redistributive policies as time goes by, and as the 1970 election becomes like closer and closer. Having said that, the 1970 election took place in September of 1970, and well, Salvador Allende was indeed the candidate that got the largest vote share, but it was only 37%. So it was a very contentious election in which the Christian Democrats got close to 34%, and then the remaining votes were for right-wing parties. So at that time period, it was when a candidate didn't obtain more than 50% of the vote, they needed to be confirmed by Congress. So between the time that Allende won that election in September of 1970, then there were like two very turbulent months between, well, basically September and October, in which there was a lot of pressure for the Congress not to confirm Allende as president. And there was a lot of fear about a democratic election of a Marxist president. He was a member of the Socialist Party, but he was part of a broader coalition that included communist and Marxist parties, and the U.S. was particularly interested in preventing Allende from taking office. And lots of events transpired during those 2 months, but at the end of the day, the Chilean Congress finally confirmed Allende as president, and so it began 1,000 days in power, where lots of very revolutionary policies took place. There was a strong opposition, and the U.S. began a process of that they call covert action, or the policy program towards Chile, to try to basically prevent Allende from being successful in a way. And there is a huge debate about what happened during the Salvador Allende years, how much of well, I'll show you in a bit, but how much of that the collapse of the macroeconomy, basically after 1 year in power, how much of that was a consequence of the economic policies that were implemented by the Allende government, how much of that was kind of like the outcome of the pressure from the US, and how much of the Cold War dynamics were influencing the way that the Allende government was doing things in a way. So that's kind of like the broad picture of what is going on in this space. So I'm going to try to divide this talk into 3 different parts. So the first part is I'll try to show you a very concrete example of what was the pressure from the inside that the Salvador Allende was facing. I think this is it's a very good example of the kind of like dynamics of the Cold War, because there's a group of left-wing revolutionaries, or kind of like more radical left-wing parties, that were trying to exert a lot of pressure on the government to try to radicalize the implementation of socialist policies, redistributive policies, and the government had a really hard time trying to cope with that. And what happened during that time period is that, well, this radicalization in a way of economic policies, it got a little bit out of hand in a way, and it had a lot of impacts. And I'll try to show you that using the concrete example of land reform. Land reform is one of the most important redistributive policies at the time, and we have very good measures of how that policy was implemented, and that's going to be a very good test in a way of the dynamics that were that took place when left-wing radicals, the left-wing in power, and the center parties and the right-wing parties are basically in conflict in terms of what policies should be implemented. But then there is also this other part, right? So there's the part of the pressure from the outside. And the US Covert Action Program is a very good example of that. They were actively trying to prevent the Allende government from being successful. This is, of course, not the only pressure from the outside. There are very well documented efforts from Brazil, for example, also trying to exert some pressure on the Allende government. There's also counter dynamics in the way that the Soviet Union could also be playing a part here. Cuba it's also playing a part here. And there is a discussion, I would say an ongoing discussion, academic discussion about, well, is Latin America looking at Cuba as kind of like the model in a way, or kind of like the inspiration, or is Latin America looking at the Soviet Union? And I would say that probably, I think most people would agree that Cuba is more important in that sense, especially for Latin American dynamics during the Cold War. And then, so I'll show you what we know about that. We have I think a very nice paper that covers some of that covert action program, which also exemplifies lots of these dynamics that we've been discussing and kind of like the interconnections across different countries at the time. And then I also show you kind of like the effort from the government. So how is the government trying to cope with the increasing demand for redistribution? What are they doing to get to families, and how that might affect the macroeconomy? And to do that, I'll show you one of the largest programs at the time. So it's a very revolutionary program that attempted to improve household finances by with a very ambitious nutrition program that basically delivered free milk for all children in the country. So this is one of the policies that were very popular at the time. It's a universal policy that is trying to help low-income families to cope with what is going on at the time. So this is going to be the outline of the talk. So hopefully you'll find it interesting and kind of like good examples of what's taking place at the time. So let me begin by just discussing the pressure from the inside. So as I said, Salvador Allende is in power. There is a land reform law in place that basically allows the state to expropriate plots if plots meet certain requirements. Of course, they're not just expropriating plots like just because they want to. They need some sort of like legal reason to do that. And at the time, this land reform law was actually passed in the early 1960s, right after the Alliance for Progress, under a right-wing government. But the right-wing government really didn't make that much use of the land reform law. They expropriated very few plots, and obviously that wasn't really going to satisfy the increasing demands from redistribution. But in 1967, under the government of the Christian Democrats, the land reform law was actually modified, and it allowed for more legal reasons for the government to expropriate plots. So now, after 1967, it was legal to expropriate plots if they were too large, which means more than a certain number of hectares, and also if the plot was inefficiently exploited. So that's, as you can tell already, that's going to be something hard to define, and something hard to define is subject to being manipulable, right? So it's going to be very easy to use that law to expropriate plots. And at the same time, obviously, the low-income agricultural workers or the working class was very interested in seeing expropriations rise, because that obviously increased their probability of actually, getting ownership, or at least partial ownership of plots, which are very valuable, of course, to produce agricultural products and to increase your income. So at the time, the way that left-wing radicals, in a way, or left-wing groups exerted pressure to increase expropriation was through land invasion. So land invasions are a very common collective action throughout the world. And the way that it works is that, well, when the landowner is not present, then just agricultural workers that some of them actually live in the plot, they just take over the plot and they start living inside, or they just close the gates and they demand for the plot to be expropriated. So when this takes place in lots of different locations at the same time, it can put a lot of pressure on the state agency in charge of expropriating these plots. And this is exactly what happened. So at the time, this was a very common strategy used by left-wing radicals to increase the intensity of this policy. And it was, in a way, very, very effective. So the way that we are trying to kind of like document this process and quantify how much of the implementation of land reform, of expropriations, to be more precise, was coming from these land invasions, is that we first gathered data on land invasion. So this is something that it's very cool when you find it, when you're an economic historian and you find data that allows you to measure something that you find meaningful when you're studying something. And we were able to find a list of all land invasions that took place during the Salvador Allende years. So the reason why this list of land invasions exists is because at the time, the Congress was extremely worried about these land invasions. They knew that they were going to exert a lot of pressure for plots being expropriated. It was going against the interest of landowners, and landowners in general in Latin America at the time are very well connected with Congress people. So they exerted a lot of pressure on the Congress to kind of like develop investigations to track and put together a list of all of these land invasions to try to cope with what is going on here. So the police in Chile was in charge of creating this, and every time there was a land invasion, they just basically went there and documented what's going on, where is this taking place, the date, and everything. So we got our hands on that data set, and that allows us to track all of the land invasions that are taking place during this time period. And we can see that once Allende takes power, basically when he becomes president, land invasions just increase dramatically, particularly because they knew that the government was going to be more sensitive to kind of like this pressure, because they want to increase the outcomes or the lives of low-income individuals and agricultural workers. So the reason why these land invasions also became more prevalent during this time period is because, as part of the increase in demand for redistribution, in 1967, there was a very famous peasant unionization law. So the 1967 law basically allowed unions to form, and this union started to be formed in 1967 onwards. So when Allende takes power, these unions are something that have been operating for the past 3 years. So they already know kind of like what they can do, how to negotiate with landowners. So they have 3 years of experience. And we know that these unions basically allow agricultural workers to meet regularly. So once a month, once every 2 months, or every week, facilitating, basically decreasing the cost of collective action and facilitating to exert pressure on landowners. So when you take a look at well, I'll show you in a minute how these land invasions take over time, but this is a process that it's taking the form of land invasions in Chile, it's taking the form of guerrillas in other places in Latin America. It's some sort of pressure, it's just a manifestation of the pressure to radicalize the implementation of these policies. And then, on the other hand, we have very good data to measure how land expropriations are taking place over this time period. So there is one state agency in Chile, the name is CORA, and CORA is actually in charge of every time that they have a reason to expropriate a plot and they proceed with the expropriation of that plot, they create this file, which is basically a simple sheet like the picture that you can see here. And in this sheet here, it's a two-sided sheet where they say, well, we're going to expropriate this plot. This plot has certain characteristics, and there's also like the name of the plot owner, and there is a reason why they're expropriating this. So at some point, we collected data as part of a broader research agenda. Actually, we collected the more than 5,000, almost 6,000 files, each one documented one of these plots expropriated. And using that, because we observe the date of the expropriation in these files, we can basically track how expropriations were taking place by month even. So in every month in different parts of the country, and what type of plots were being created and what legal reasons were used to expropriate these plots. So this is incredibly useful. It's very good micro data that is available for anyone to use as well. And a lot of people have used it after we constructed this more than, well, almost 15 years ago. So when you take a look at what's happening with expropriation, so it's basically just analyzing the data that we digitize, so the digitalization of these almost 6,000 files, microfiles, you can see that over this time period, so there's 3 governments from 1958 onwards. So the land reform process started in the early 1960s. And you can see here that very few expropriations were taking place under the right-wing government of Jorge Alessandri. Only 21 plots were expropriated. These were usually 14% were large plots. No inefficient plot was expropriated. And it's kind of like a very small process. And then under Eduardo Frei, the Christian Democrat, from 1964 until 1970, some more plots began to be expropriated. And then in 1970, when Salvador Allende takes power, this process just explodes. So you can see here in the right-hand side, there's a figure of the number of plots that are being expropriated. And you can see that there's a very clear increase in the number of expropriations after November of 1970, basically, when Salvador Allende takes power. So this is one of the things that changes a lot when there is a left-wing government in power that really wants to satisfy this demand for redistribution and deal with the existing inequality in land ownership as well in the countryside. And as you can see here as well, in September of 1973, a military coup basically interrupted Salvador Allende's government, and expropriations just ended. There weren't many more expropriations after that, and actually the Pinochet dictatorship that followed reverted most of the expropriations that took place during the Salvador Allende years. So what is so I promised you also I was going to show you kind of like the dynamics of land invasions. You can see here that unfortunately before 1970, before Allende's government, we don't have granular data for land invasions. We only have the kind of like the annual number of land invasions. And you can see here that before 1967, there was basically no land invasions. It was very there was no unions. People were very disconnected. Agricultural workers were very disconnected in the countryside. And after 1967, this process starts to rise quite a bit. And then during Allende, well, the number of land invasions just increases markedly. If you just like sum everything that you observe here in panel D, this is going to be like a number that is like over here in a way. Okay. Invasions are taking place during the whole period that Allende is in power. They started right in November of 1970. And the idea was basically to increase the process of expropriations. I'm not sure if I have to answer questions like on the go or do I answer those like towards the end? But well, I guess I'll just answer them towards the end. If you guys can guide me, Jesus, Ivan, or Fernando, what is like the usual? I'm happy to stop and answer questions, but
you can answer after. So we will have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. So this is kind of like the process that is taking place. I don't need, I guess, to convince you that a lot of invasions are taking place during this time period. It's a very simple way to exert pressure to increase the demand for the distribution. In this case, just expropriations that agricultural workers are going to be able to own and exploit, hopefully in the future after redistribution has taken place. So if you just take a look at these two kind of like data sets together, like the process of the pressure from the inside and the expropriations, we are able to construct kind of like 221 counties within Chile. So these are local areas. These are all agricultural areas. So you can think about this as rural municipalities, very heavily dependent on agriculture. And you can see that there is like there's close to 8 invasions during the Salvador Allende per municipality. There is also close to 12 expropriations in each one of these. and most of them have at least one invasion or one expropriation. Okay, so this process is taking place mostly everywhere. Almost all counties across the country, almost all rural counties are experiencing invasions and expropriations. So the key thing here is like how these two are related, right? So we spent quite a bit of time showing, well, using statistical evidence that when an invasion takes place, then expropriations follow in the next couple of months, and we spend quite a bit of time showing you that that relationship seems to be causal. Of course, invasions are not taking place in any location across the country. They're usually taking place in kind of like more in locations where agricultural production is larger, where but yeah, I mean, I think what's more important is that these invasions are not taking place in places where Salvador Allende was relatively more strong or where people were more politically engaged. They were just taking place in locations where they had the opportunity to invade a plot and exert this pressure. So yeah, so I think this kind of like dynamic between kind of like left-wing groups trying to exert pressure to change the policy agenda in a way, and kind of like what the government is doing it's a very good example of the dynamics of the time. So I remember that I mean there's a very big discussion of kind of like more of a history discussion about like the kind of like the two souls within the left-wing coalition. There's clearly a more kind of like conservative part of the left-wing coalition that they're trying to advance little by little towards socialism. So they are very clearly stating that they want to move towards a socialist society. But they're doing this step by step. And there's another part of the left-wing coalition that is a little bit more radical, that they're trying to advance. They want to advance quickly. Okay, and this dynamic of how fast should we implement these changes, it's always there. And it's actually, there's a very nice documentation of when Fidel Castro visited Chile at the time. He spent quite a bit of time in Chile trying to understand the process during the Salvador Allende years. And yeah, there's a very famous sentence where he says something like, well, clearly, if we want to transition towards socialism, the government needs to do more. They need to increase expropriations. They need to do way more than they're currently doing. Kind of like siding with the more revolutionary part of the left wing in a way. And in a way, so you talk to left wing radicals at the time that, well, they're a little bit older than now, but many of them are still alive. They're gonna say that, yeah, like Allende. There's a phrase where there's a saying in Chile where Allende is a little bit yellow, it's a little bit amarillo. So he's not very radical. He's not very lefty. He's just a little bit conservative in the way that he was doing things. So there is this tension that is taking place at the time. So here you can see that invasions were way more prevalent in the right-hand side figure, that invasions were more prevalent in places where there were more unions at the time. So the redistribution was large, but at the same time, when you increase redistribution, it's not as straightforward to increase the intensity of these policies. So on the one hand side, you have that expropriating a plot, it's hard. So actually you need to pay the owner for the plot. It's not like you just get it for free. And you also need to organize what's going to happen when the expropriation takes place. So in this case, plots were put under a communal ownership, and then they remain in there for quite a bit of time. But obviously, agricultural workers had trouble exploiting that if they didn't have the financial resources, basically access to capital to exploit that those plots, right? So this is a dynamic that is also taking place. So kind of like a policy that is being implemented more intensively, but without the support of complementary policies that are going to allow agricultural workers to make the most out of the plots. And this is something that I consider kind of like in a way, kind of like a failed implementation of the land reform, because it was always incomplete. It never allowed for full redistribution, and it never allowed the workers to actually exploit this. And obviously, because of the 1973 coup, most of these plots were even given back to their previous owners or just sold in markets. And that was actually one of a common outcome of these plots that were redistributed. They would just put on sale, from this communal ownership because they didn't have the resources to exploit them and the workers needed money. So at the end of the day, the land reform was a huge fail if you take them kind of like in a long run perspective, because it was just a change of ownership among the elites in a way. I would argue as an economist that it's kind of like an efficient redistribution of plots among the elite, because the people that bought these plots are actually the ones that value the most, I guess. So in that sense, it could be an efficient redistribution within the elite. So this is one example of the pressure that was coming from the inside. Like I said, this pressure is coming from it's taking different forms. So you can also find protests taking place in more kind of like urban areas, and also the occupation factory is taking place. But it's the same idea. It's the same idea of trying to exert pressure to redistribute in some way or another, increase wages or something. But this is not the only dynamic taking place. There's also pressure from the outside. I think one of the most famous one is the US Covert Action Program. So let me tell you a little bit about this. So this is not new. We know that hegemonic states in general, like so superpowers, are usually using economic policy to change policy platforms elsewhere. So in other countries, they do this using a variety of different policy tools. You might be familiar with the most recent ones used in the context of the current worldwide conflict, and these policies are usually they can take the kind of like two different forms, right? So one form is what we now know as economic sanctions, and examples of economic sanctions are many. So you can do like travel bans. Somebody says that there is a problem with the slides. But I guess you're all seeing the slides or not? Is this like a problem of just one person, or is it more general?
I'm seeing the slides without any problem.
Okay, so I'm going to assume that it's just a single problem with the slides. So these economic sanctions can take many different forms. So maybe you heard about embargoes. You can take maybe you heard about lending cuts, asset freezes, travel bans, and so forth. There's also like new economic sanctions that are known as kind of like smart sanctions that are a little bit more targeted. So this is taking place through the entirety of the 20th century. Even in the 19th century, you also observe some of these economic sanctions. So it's in the context of the Cold War, they are pretty common in a way. And the idea is the framing for these economic sanctions to take place is this ideological war between the Soviet Union and the US, right? So when Salvador Allende becomes a president of Chile, the US is very worried, actually. President Richard Nixon is very worried about socialism spreading kind of like in the backyard of the US. And they weren't very worried about Chile in itself. Chile is a very small country. It's not very important, like in the geopolitical sense. But they were worried about the possibility of this of socialism in Chile kind of like spreading over Latin America and becoming kind of like a larger process that could interfere with the US influence in South America and Latin America. Now, economic sanctions are not like a kind of like a silver bullet. Like we've spent quite a bit of time as economists trying to understand what are their impacts. And there are many of these economic sanctions that actually don't work. They don't exert much pressure. And kind of like one of the most simplest ways, the simpler way to think about this is that well, it's very easy to substitute in the global economy. So if the US doesn't want to give you something, maybe you can go to a different country. So as long as not everyone is implementing some sort of like economic sanction on you, maybe you still have some sort of option. So this substitution is very prevalent in kind of like decreasing the effectiveness of these economic sanctions. Economic sanctions are usually overt economic policies. They're clear, they're stated in the context of the current conflict worldwide. We know which those are. Presidents or leaders or country leaders are very explicit in saying what they are doing and what they are trying to accomplish. But sometimes this doesn't happen for strategical reasons. So in that case, these economic sanctions are more well known as covert action. So you're basically trying to exert some sort of pressure in another country, but you're trying to do it covertly, so without people really noticing. So this was exactly the case with Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger in the US. After Allende was confirmed by the US by the Chilean Congress in 1970, there's all this material that documents the conversation between Nixon and Kissinger, and Nixon very famously said, well, I want you to make the Chilean economy scream, and I want to prevent Allende from coming to power, and if he comes to power, I want to unseat him. Of course, they can't do this overtly, because if they are, in a way, US is trying to position themselves as kind of like champions for democracy. So they don't want people, other countries, to see them as trying to interfere with democratic elections or democratic processes that are taking place. So when like publicly, Nixon was kind of like in a way a little bit oblivious of Allende, or he wasn't very explicit that he wanted to do this with the Chilean economy. So there were like several different strategies that were taking place at the time. One of them was trying to create economic pressure on the Chilean economy to kind of like destabilize the economy, and then hopefully people were going to complain, and then they were going to unseat Allende through democratic means, in a way. There were other processes as well. They were in constant negotiations with opposition parties to try to put publicity out there, basically saying bad things about Allende, or trying to convince the military to conduct a coup d'etat to unseat Allende. So there are many different tracks, in a way, that were taking place at the time. So this covert action program there's a very large discussion to kind of like understand what was the impact that it had on the Chilean economy, and it's really hard to actually know that. But we do know that they were trying to do this, and we do know that they did several things. So one of them is that they prevented, they try to use their power in multilateral development banks to prevent, for example, international loans to flow to the Allende government. They also have been, they're not very good measures of this, but allegedly they're also decreasing their exports to Chile. We actually do have some estimates of that, and that does seem to be the case. So exports did decrease significantly, more than from other countries in Chile at the time. And but the question remains, like, how much of what is happening to the economy in Chile can be blamed to the US, kind of like pressure, or kind of like how much of that is basically driven from the inside, from pressure of left-wing radicals, and how much of this is coming simply from the economic policy that Allende thought it was good for the country, but it turns out that it wasn't. So what we do to kind of like get a sense of what is happening at the time, we collected data on firms, kind of the most important firms operating in Chile. So you can think about this as the largest manufacturing firms, the largest agricultural firms, the largest mining, the largest firms in the mining industry. And then we realized that the US has different connections to these very large firms. So they're not so much providing like loans, but they're more of like providing financial services for them. So they're acting as underwriters, and they're giving a lot of financial services, especially US banks, so private banks. And so what we can do is kind of like compare the operations of firms that were heavily reliant on the US private sector and other firms that were more reliant on other countries. For example, the UK banking sector, or the Brazilian banking sector, or the Spanish banking sector, and so on. So when we do that, we can get a very good sense of what's happening to the economy in Chile. So we basically observed almost 100 firms during this time period, and we know a lot of information about them for every year before the Salvador Allende government, and from every year afterwards. You can see here, for example, one of the reports that we use to kind of get a sense of what is happening to the economy. This is one of the largest agricultural firms of the time. They have a board of directors, they have managers, they also have bank relationships here in this red square here, and we observed lots of things about their operations. So we do know their balance sheets, their income statements, kind of like their bank relationships, and what was their connection to the U.S. economy before Salvador Allende and afterwards. And we also know the value of these firms by just looking at stock price data from newspapers. And so we really try to understand that. And what we first document, which is very important, I think, kind of like a stepping stone towards the remaining of the analysis, is that right after 1970, all of U.S. banks cut links with the Chilean firms, with the ones that had relationships. So, and this did not happen with other banks. So if you just take a look at, for example, UK bank, one UK bank and one US bank connected to a large firm in Chile, right after Salvador Allende comes to power, then the US bank says, okay, I'm not going to do business with you anymore, so I'm leaving. And they leave. And there's no more business with US banks. But this doesn't happen with the UK bank. So there's definitely something different about the US in relation to the Chilean economy. And this took a while to be reverted. So if you kind of take a long look, this is the right-hand side panel here, only towards the end of the 1970s, we revert back to the situation before Allende took power. So after 1970, the US is basically kind of withdrawing from Chile, little by little. However, when you go and take a look at what happens to these firms that lose this connection to the US because the US just withdraw, well, they don't seem to be very much affected, okay? And this is kind of makes sense at the time. So the Chilean firms have other options, so they can go to banks in the Soviet Union, they can go to banks in Europe, they can go to large banks in Latin America, and they can even go to banks domestically. So the Salvador Allende was pretty revolutionary in what they wanted to do with the Chilean economy. They wanted to get control of the most important firms in strategic industries. But before doing that, they wanted to get control of the banking sector because they knew that the banking sector was crucial to kind of fuel resources towards the strategic firms. So they very quickly got control of most of the banks. So you can see here in the right-hand side figure that before the Allende period, there was approximately kind of 23 banks at the time. Only one of those was owned by the state. The vast majority of banks were private. And then right after Allende takes power, only a couple of months afterwards, we can see that they are very successful in getting basically majority of ownership in most banks. So by 1972, they already have control of close to 20 banks. Some of them remain private, but the vast majority of them became part of the public sector. So what happened here is something that it's in the very same spirit of what I was saying before. So these firms that used to have were receiving lots of financial services from US banks, basically they just substituted towards domestic banks. And all of the services that we provide by the US, they were now being provided by either other international banks or domestic banks. We actually document that most of the action come from state banks. So these firms are able to substitute these financial relationships. Now, there is a question, of course, of how sustainable this strategy of substitution is, and if this is good in the long run or not, but we're not going to be able to know the answer to that question just because, well, the 1973 coup took place and we never got to see the end of it in a way. So I would say that, of course, there was other pressures that were taking place from the outside, both from the state, private sector, and other actors. Like I said before, there are fewer loans from multilateral development banks. Those are well documented, but it's just, they're large loans, but it's just a couple of loans that are not taking place because one of the US officers basically refuses to give some sort of loan to the Allende government. There are fewer imports from the US and there are lots of strikes taking place. So there is a connection that is being emphasized quite a bit by history work, I would say, that the decrease in imports basically kind of sparked lots of protests in big cities. And one of them was very popular. It was a strike led by truckers, so the truck industry, and in Chile, the truck owners have a lot of power because Chile is just a very thin and long country that has very few highways. So if you just cut a very very strategic kind of like points in the highway network, then you can disrupt the entire economy. So that put a lot of pressure actually in the government. But we don't really know very well like the empirical connection between the inputs and the parts that were allegedly were missing from truckers at the time. So when you take a look at the whole literature as a whole, both the history literature, the kind of like the scattered evidence that we have, I would say that the pressure from the outside is likely to have been very effective. It probably had some minor effects on the economy, but in the overall scheme of things, I would say that it's relatively minor. But yeah, we definitely need more evidence on this space, but it's really hard. So it's difficult to kind of get a sense of this the relative contribution of both the pressure from the inside and the pressure from the outside. But I would say that the pressure from the inside is definitely larger, and it's more constant, it's more real in a way, and it's more it's affecting day to day the implementation of policies day to day. But there are also other policies being implemented that are not responding to kind of like what is happening both from left-wing radicals and on the outside. They're just policies that the government thought they were good policies. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit in the last part of this talk. I wanted to tell you a little bit about what the government was doing, and I'm going to give you again one example of that, and kind of like what was happening to the macroeconomy as a whole. Okay, so the Allende government was very interested in kind of like developing and implementing policies to improve the lives of low-income individuals, household finances, just the lives of the working class. But they were also obviously very interested in remaining popular, right? So they wanted to remain popular because they wanted to remain in power. And there are elections taking place. Like in every democracy, there was one election in 1971. It's a local elections for mayors, but it was only a couple of months after Allende took power. So it wasn't really, I mean, they didn't have time to do many things. So it wasn't really like an evaluation of or an assessment of the government at the time. It's just a local election, I would say. But then in 1973, there was another election that many people forget. So in March of 1973, so exactly 50 years ago, there was a Congress election. And that Congress election was pretty much perceived as a referendum for the Allende government. And it was advertised as such, and the government knew that it was important to get support in that. So they are they're implementing economic policy, knowing that they also need a certain majority in Congress to actually proceed with the transition to socialism as they wanted. But they also know that if they do it wrongly, then the opposition can get a majority or actually 2/3 of seats in Congress, and then he can basically constitutionally be kicked out of the job. So if the opposition has more than 2/3 of seats in Congress, then they basically can remove Allende through means of the Constitution simply. So to kind of understand these dynamics of the government trying to remain popular, trying to increase the lives of low-income individuals, trying to take care of the macroeconomy, kind of like having an eye on the 1970 election, we are going to study one very, very popular policy at the time, which was attempting to, and actually was successful in distributing milk, so free milk to all children in the country. So from children from 0 to 6, and there was it was not a means tested program. It was just completely universal. So everyone who wanted milk, they just got it. They just have to go to the local hospital and get the milk. And as you know, milk is the most important source of proteins and calories for small children. So let me tell you a little bit about the rationale of this policy and why it was so important, and a good example of the spirit of the time from the point of view of what the government is trying to do. So the first milk programs, as many other policies, began to be implemented by non-state actors in the 20th century. It was basically individuals from the elite trying to copy European experiences. And at the time, so these elite individuals were going to low-income neighborhoods, and they were just distributing as much milk as they could. And they quickly realized by actually comparing infant mortality rates of individuals that were receiving free meal with other low-income individuals that weren't, that infant mortality rates was decreasing significantly more in those locations that were receiving milk. So this was actually a pretty important step to convince the government to do it in an institutionalized way through a program founded in 1954 and known as the PNAC. So it's a program it's a nutritional program. And then, but yeah, this is taking place as many other policies are being implemented right from the start in 1971. But many of these policies were, in fact, very expensive. And the rationale for the implementation of policies at the time was kind of like grounded in a Keynesian framework, in which they argued that there were lots of resources that were underutilized. So if they were able to increase demand, then they were going to be able to increase production without actually causing inflation. So they had a framework, kind of like an academic framework to think about what they were going to do. But they completely, and I think this is this is not very controversial, they completely misunderstood the underutilization of resources. And when they expanded spending, for example, it led to something that we can very easily predict using a framework from introduction to macroeconomics. So in 1961, there is a boom completely driven by government spending. And then right after that, when the economy is not able to absorb all of that spending coming from the government, then you know what happens. Inflation starts to ramp up, it starts to increase, and GDP growth starts to collapse. Black markets start to arise, and most of this dynamic that is taking place, so the collapse of the macroeconomy, the 600% inflation towards early 1973 and late 1972, it's completely driven by this. Well, I won't say completely, but it's the majority of it is driven by economic policy, actually. And kind of like this idea of just spending resources. Of course, the milk program is contributing to that. It's incredibly expensive. Is basically buying almost all of the production from local farmers, and it's the remaining of the milk is being imported. And the price of milk in the international market is increasing, so this is putting a lot of pressure on the budget. And as you can see, people weren't oblivious about this. Like, they were very conscious that the macroeconomy was collapsing. You can see here that this is a very famous thing that happened during this time period. There were long queues to simply buy bread, oil, and basic food. And real wages were also collapsing. So by the time of the coup, real wages were incredibly low, and inflation was super high, and the macroeconomy was collapsing in a way. So in this context, it's very interesting, because how are you going to face an election, the 1973 election, when you're trying to transition towards socialism, but your macroeconomy is collapsing? So the basic models that we have from the mid-20th century, I would say, would predict that everyone is going to vote against the Allende government. They don't like to queue to get their bread. They don't like to queue to get their oil. They don't like the real wages to be low. Okay, but at the same time, there are all these other programs that are being implemented. So the meal program is just one example, but there are many of them that are trying to improve the lives of low-income individuals. So there is this tension about the macroeconomy collapsing, but kind of like the government taking care of your household finances by helping you as much as they need, as much as they can. So the milk program is an example of that. It was one of the leading policies of the time. It was featuring prominent speeches and campaign. It was something that it was actually agreed by the opposition that it was a good policy. And most evaluations at the time considered the policy to be successful. So we have very good metrics of who was coming for the milk. The take-up rate of this program is larger than 80%. This means that out of 100 children that were eligible for this, 80 of them actually went to the hospital to get the milk. There was lots of informational campaigns being implemented by the government to inform people, to educate people about the importance of milk. So the take-up, in a way, is as a consequence of the efforts done by the government. And in that context, the election takes place. And as I said before, this election is pretty much perceived as a referendum. So you can see here the kind of like the cover of an important newspaper at the time, where it says, citizens evaluate the Marxist government. Chile, a big referendum. So they are indeed perceiving this election as, okay, is the Allende coalition going to be successful in this policy or not? Like the macroeconomy is collapsing. The US was expecting, even though it's unclear how much of their efforts were contributing to the collapse of the macroeconomy, they were expecting people to vote against Allende, the opposition to come out strong out of this election, and in order to unseat Allende through the means of the constitution. This election, you can find these quotes from a lot of primary, secondary sources. This election is a plebiscite, the most important in Chile's history at the time. The elections were widely considered as having the power to decide Chile's future, to be shaped by democracy, dictatorship, or civil war. And then these dynamics of policies the government trying to take care were also kicking in. We know that the milk program was very successful in delivering milk to children. We actually have we were able at some point to construct a panel data of hospitals and how much milk was distributed to all of the hospitals that existed at the time. And we know that right after Allende took power, milk distribution just increased markedly, and milk was following beneficiaries pretty closely. So you try to predict where milk is going to be distributed. The only predictor of that is where children are actually located. It's not where Allende got the most vote in 1970 or something like that. It's just where the beneficiaries are located. And the program was very successful in doing that. So we spent in the article that we are putting together actually right now, we provide very, very compelling evidence, I would say, that the program was successful in driving support for the Salvador Allende government. So something that I didn't tell you, I think I just skipped it. Something that I didn't tell you is that this is very important. So when the 1973 election takes place, the Allende coalition actually comes out pretty strong, and they increase the number of the vote share that they get when compared to 1970. So in 1970 they got 37% of the vote, and in 1973 they got close to 45. So there is a 9 percentage point increase between 1970 and 1973, despite the fact that the macroeconomy was collapsing. And the milk program and these kind of like universal policies that benefit low-income individuals and the working class disproportionately can explain a little bit of approximately half of that increase in support for the Allende government. The milk program was not only very popular, it was very successful in decreasing infant mortality. So we also collected very good data to kind of like understand how infant mortality varies across the different hospitals over time when the Allende government increases the amount of milk that they're distributing. And we can see that it's very successful in decreasing the mortality rates of children that are that benefit particularly from milk. So 1 month to 1 year old kids, because breastfeeding rates in that kind of like age bracket is not very large. And after that, children just start consume basically solid foods and depend way less on milk. So the milk program doesn't decrease infant mortality of 3 year old, for example. It only decreases infant mortality of 1 month to 1 year old children. So we have this very nice data set where we can track all of these dynamics and provide evidence of that. And like I said before, the milk program is particularly important for children. So we can compare kind of like what is the popularity of Allende among women in their 20s or in their 30s that have a kid and women in their 20s and their 30s that don't have a kid. We can actually do that using surveys all the time. There's a very famous sociologist that is implementing surveys across cities in Chile all over the 60s and the early 70s. And he was doing actually the first polls, political polls at the time. And he literally asked, so who are you, a couple of months before the election, so who are you going to vote for in the 1973 election? And we can see how these voting preferences change or differ between women with kids, women without kids, women in the 20s, women in the 60s, women who value the milk program, women who don't value the milk program. And then we can also kind of like understand how people value these policies that Allende government was implementing. So one of the other very innovative things that this sociologist was doing, he was asking open questions to people during different governments. So which is your favorite policy that is being implemented during this time period? And during the Frey government, housing policies were very popular. The land reform program was very popular. During the Allende government, the nationalization program, so basically getting control of banks and firms, was very popular. And the milk program starts to appear as one of the policies that were more valued by individuals at the time. And we consider this kind of like a proxy for these universal policies that were disproportionately benefiting low-income individuals. And one very interesting thing is that if we want to understand this support as well a little bit more, we can even make use of a very peculiar institution at the time in which women and men actually voted in different booths at the time. And this took place for many decades in Chile. So we can kind of like take a look at what happens to voting patterns in booths, in women booths, in men booths, and in locations where there were more beneficiaries, less beneficiaries, where they distributed more milk, where they distributed more milk, and so on. And we can see that all of this effect that these universal programs are having on the increasing support for the Allende coalition is coming from women. That this is not very controversial. So in fact, the government was explicitly targeting women as the key link between children's nutrition and the milk program. So, and one way they did that was through these very creative posters that they put together. They basically stick outside of stores throughout the country, where they were depicting women as being very strong and giving like milk to children. So this is exactly what they were trying to do. And just to wrap up, so you can see here that Allende actually increased its support in 1973 in this election, but this was to the concern of many people. So you can see here a very nice quote, I think, that reflects a lot of the spirit of the time, in which what surprised U.S. onlookers was the relative insignificance that Chile's economic difficulties had on the election results. Washington singled out that a coup as the only way it could truly save Chile. So they were basically realizing that Chileans didn't really care about the macroeconomy collapsing, and the government could remain strong with these micro policies that could be even could even damage kind of like the national budget, but they were valued by people. And well, we don't know what happened, because, you know, after 1973, just a couple of months after the election took place, there was 1973 coup. And a lot of things were reverted at that time, and the economic policies that were implemented were kind of like in the opposite spectrum of the policies that you can imagine. Lots of more reforms kind of like towards market-oriented reforms were implemented in the 1970s and early 1980s that transformed the Chilean economy in the exact opposite direction that Allende was taking it. So I think that's pretty much it. You can see many of my research and things that we've been discussing in my website. You can contact me if you have questions. This is my email address, and you can also follow me on Twitter for paper updates. That's the only thing that I put out there, just when new working papers or new publications and that type of stuff. So thank you very much for your attention. I don't know if I should just answer questions now.
Yes, we have a time for a couple of questions, so I will select a couple of them. So let's start with the, is there evidence of sanctions strengthening the opinion of the elites against Allende? Obviously a much harder thing to measure.
Can you say that again? Sorry, I didn't hear you very well.
Yeah, sorry. Even if use pressure had a minor effect on the macroeconomy, is there evidence of sanctions turning or strengthening the opinion of the elites against Allende?
Not that I know of. There is that type of evidence. It's available in other settings. There's actually a pretty, I would say, a pretty vivid literature right now taking place in the context of Russia, the recent sanctions on Russia and Iran. And so there's pretty compelling evidence, I would say, that targeted sanctions can do that. But in the context of the Allende government, I don't know of any good evidence that. There's certainly narratives that point towards that direction, but I don't know if any good evidence showing that. Yeah.
So another question, besides just macroeconomic stability, is there any evidence as to how the Allende policies translated into changes in agricultural production or Chilean productivity in general?
Yes, so there is a sense of what was the impact of the increase in government spending in 1971, that it basically overheated the economy and created this all of this increasing production, but was a little bit like unsustainable in a way because there wasn't much underutilization of resources. Now, like more kind of like industry level studies, there was an attempt, a very big attempt to try to link the agrarian reform to agricultural output, but the evidence was just not there. It's one of those cases in which when you try to measure what happened to agricultural production in places where there was more redistribution, it was just a big noisy estimate. So you cannot really reject anything. So unfortunately, no, there is some evidence. So there's a working paper kind of like showing that some of this redistribution to the land reform process actually kind of like changed the composition of the agricultural industry, also including forestry, but no more than that. Obviously, it's very hard to evaluate this because of the 1973 coup that interrupted a lot of the land reform process.
And one final question, going back to the land invasions, are they typically accompanied by violence? And if they are large landowners forming militia response? And he's thinking specifically about comparing it with Colombia, where there was a paramilitary response.
Yeah, of course, these are not, so some of them can be non-violent land invasions, but some of them can become very violent and can lead to conflict. So it's not hard to find historical evidence of landowners actually fighting agricultural workers that are trying to invade plots. But yeah, how systematic that is hard to tell. So these reports that I just showed you don't contain a lot of information about violence during these land invasions. So I would say, if I would have to guess, I would say that lots of these land invasions are taking place with violence, and lots of them are also taking place kind of like in a relatively pacific way. Yeah. But yeah, so you can imagine also that not all landowners are going to respond to land invasions with violence. Some of them are just, yeah, this is an inefficient plot, I'm just going to offer this. So in fact, one of the legal reasons to expropriate a plot is when the landowner just decides to offer the plot to the state. And that happens quite a bit of time during the Allende years. If I remember correctly, it's 25% of the time, or 20%, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Felipe. It was very good to have you. So I will be uploading this talk on our YouTube channel later today. And let everyone remember that next week we will have Holy Week, so we won't have any talk, and we will return the following week with the 80s and the debt crisis and so on. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, Felipe.
Thank you very much for the invitation.